Some walls are 6 inches of plaster, some are 18 years thick, and sometimes the only way through is 2 knocks in the dark and someone knocking back. Our story begins now. The hydrangea was dying, and Hermione Granger was letting it. That was the point, really. She stood on the cracked flagstones of the back garden at 7:30 in the morning with a green plastic watering can in one hand, and she watched the brown creep up the leaves, and she did nothing about it. There was a spell for this. There had been a spell for everything once. For wilting, for blight, for the small daily deaths that happened in a garden. And the fact that she could remember the wand movement and simply refused to make it was, in its way, the most peaceful thought she'd had all week. Let it die. Let something die that wasn't important. The kitchen behind her smelled of burnt toast and instant coffee, both of which she had produced with her own hands, badly, and both of which she had eaten with something close to reverence. 11 months in this house. 11 months of a life so small it could fit in a shoebox. The 8:14 train, a desk at Whitlow and Pierce with a nameplate that said H. Granger and meant nothing to anybody. Viewings on Saturdays, a cat who despised her, and a mobile telephone she still occasionally addressed out loud before remembering it couldn't hear her. Nobody had written to her in 4 months. Nobody had needed saving. It was the closest thing to happiness she could currently identify. Then, from over the fence, came a sound. Not a large sound. That was what made it terrible. It was the small, dry, deliberate scrape of a garden gate being opened by someone who did not know that the hinge on that particular gate had been broken since the previous owner's divorce. Number 14 had stood empty since March. Number 14 had been her buffer, her wall of blessed nothing, the reason she'd taken this house over the one with the better kitchen. Hermione turned. Above the sagging line of the fence, moving toward the derelict greenhouse, there was a head of hair so pale it looked bleached by a hex. The watering can hit the flagstones. Water went everywhere, over her slippers, into the dead hydrangea, which was not going to appreciate it. She was across the garden before she had made any decision to move. Her hand was at her hip. The old motion, the animal one, the one 11 months of Muggle life had not managed to unlearn, and it closed on the pocket of a dressing gown where there had been no wand since last September. Her fingers curled around cotton and lint and a bus ticket. You. He had already stopped. That was the infuriating thing. He had heard her coming, and he had simply stopped and turned, unhurried, one hand still resting on the gate, wearing a grey wool coat far too good for a garden in a Muggle suburb on a Tuesday. Draco Malfoy looked at her over the fence for a long moment. Something moved behind his face and was put away again before she could read it. Granger, are you stalking me? No. 11 months. Her voice came out cracked at the edges, which she hated. 11 months, Malfoy. I changed everything. I gave up. Her throat closed on the size of that sentence, and she went around it. Nobody knows where I am. Nobody. Not Harry, not Ron, not the Ministry, not one single reporter. And I have been careful. I have been so unbelievably careful. And this morning I come outside and there you are, in that coat on my fence, like some sort of... It isn't your fence. He said it quite mildly. It's the boundary, We each own half. Do not. You raised the subject of the fence. I will set fire to you. With what? It came out before he could stop it. She watched him not stop it, and his jaw tightened afterwards, a small betrayal, as though he'd meant to be careful too. The morning stood very still between them. Somewhere down the lane, a car door shut. A blackbird was making a great deal of noise in the yew hedge, and the air had that raw green smell that comes off cut grass and wet brick. And Hermione Granger stood in her dressing gown with cold water soaking through her slippers, and felt the whole small shoebox of her life beginning to buckle. "Why are you here?" she said. Not a question, a demand, flat as a slab. "I live here." "You don't." "I signed for it on the 14th. He reached into the coat. She flinched, an involuntary jolt, the shoulder going back, the chin coming up, and she saw him register it. Saw him slow his hand deliberately, saw him bring it out open and empty-palmed first, before reaching again, and hated him for the courtesy. "Papers," he said. "Muggle ones. I'm told they're binding." "I don't want your papers. You should look at them." "Why?" "Because," said Malfoy, and there was something in his voice now, some faint, dry note, like a match not quite catching. "You'll enjoy it." He held the folded sheaf out over the fence. She did not take it for 4 full seconds. Then she snatched it hard enough to tear the top corner. Contract of sale. 14 Wisteria Lane. Vendor, the estate of the late Margaret Ann Dunhill. Purchaser, D.L. Malfoy. Handling agency, Whitlow and Pierce, 6 Cranbourne Street. And at the bottom, in the box marked Agent, in her own small upright hand, in the blue ink of the pen she kept clipped to her diary because she was constantly losing pens, H. Granger. The paper made a sound. It took her a second to understand the sound was her hands. She had signed 41 contracts in March. She remembered March the way one remembers a fever. The office thermostat broken, the phone ringing without pause, 3 viewings a day, a stack of files on the corner of her desk that never got shorter no matter how late she stayed. She had stopped reading the buyers' names somewhere around the 2nd week. There had been no reason to read them. Names were the part of the job that didn't matter. Names were what she had come here to escape. And so she had gone through March signing at the bottom of things without ever once looking at the top. She had sold him the house. She had sold Draco Malfoy the house next door to hers with her own hand and taken the commission and put it toward a new boiler. "No," she said. "Yes." "No, this is... You arranged this." "Granger." He tilted his head very slightly. "Consider what you're accusing me of. You're suggesting I discovered where you lived, purchased the adjoining property at a price I can only describe as an insult to the concept of value, and then engineered matters so that you handled the paperwork in order to, what precisely, mow near you. I don't know what you want. I have never once known what you want." Something happened in his face then. It was very fast and very quiet, and it did not look like triumph. It looked, for one entirely unbearable instant, like a man being handed something he'd expected and had been hoping not to get. "Nothing," he said. "I want nothing. I looked at 11 houses. This one has a south wall and no neighbors who ask questions, and it was cheap. And I didn't know until the 9th of last month that the name on the agency's letterhead was yours, and by then I had paid for it." He paused. I very nearly didn't come. But you came. I'd paid for it, he repeated, as though that settled the entire architecture of the thing, and perhaps for him it did. Hermione looked down at the paper. Her signature looked back up at her, cheerful and looping and entirely oblivious, the signature of a woman who had thought she was buying herself a quiet year. I gave up magic, she said. She hadn't intended to say it. It came out on its own, thin and strange in the morning air, and afterwards she stood there appalled at herself because she hadn't said that sentence aloud to a single living person. Not to Harry, who had written 4 letters she hadn't answered. Not to Ginny, who had sent a howler that she'd let burn itself out on the doorstep. Not to the woman at the corner shop who asked about her week. Malfoy said nothing. He didn't say, "Don't be absurd," and he didn't say, "You can't," and he didn't say why. He stood with one hand on a broken gate, and he looked at her, and the silence he made was not empty. It had a shape. It had the shape of a person choosing, with visible effort, not to reach for the obvious thing. "All right," he said at last. "All right. You've told me a fact. I've received it." He straightened his cuff, a small, unnecessary motion, the wool already flat. "Would you like the papers back, or shall I assume you're keeping them as a souvenir?" She thrust them at him. He took them. Their fingers did not touch because she made sure of it, angling her hand so that the paper passed between them like something contagious. And she saw, in his very slight pause, that he had noticed that too. "Malfoy." Her voice had steadied. That was the worst part. She could hear herself becoming reasonable, and reasonable was a coffin. "This isn't going to work. You know it isn't. You can sell. You've the money. You can sell it in a week and take the loss and never think about it again." "I could." "Then do it." He put the papers back inside his coat. He turned toward the gate and stopped and looked back over his shoulder. And there was no sneer in it at all, which frightened her considerably more than a sneer would have. "I've spent 3 years being asked to go elsewhere," said Draco Malfoy. "I bought the house because it's the first thing I've owned that nobody gave me. Grass grows there. I'm told it needs cutting." He put a hand on the broken hinge. "Good morning, Granger." And he went in through the gate and shut it, and the shut sound was small and dry and final. Hermione stood in her ruined slippers in her dying garden with water pooling around her feet, and she did not go inside for a long time, because it had just occurred to her, with the slow, cold clarity of a stone going down through deep water, that the man now living 6 feet from her kitchen window was the only person in England who knew where she was, and the only person in England who had absolutely no intention of telling anyone. She had no idea which of those things was worse. The lawnmower started at 6 o'clock in the morning. Hermione came awake the way she had learned to come awake in a tent in the Forest of Dean, all at once, whole, with her heart already going and one hand already flung out toward the bedside table, where there was nothing but a glass of water, a paperback about the Napoleonic Wars, and her reading glasses, which she knocked to the floor. For 3 seconds, she did not know what year it was. Then the sound resolved itself, a flat, mechanical droning, rising and falling as it turned, the unmistakable petrol snarl of a machine being pushed up and down a stretch of grass. and she lay flat on her back in the grey half-dark, with her pulse hammering in her throat. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, he is doing it on purpose. She lay there for 11 minutes. She counted them on the clock. She listened to the engine reach the top of the garden, pause, turn, come back down. Up, turn, down. There was a horrible regularity to it, a metronomic patience, and every time it faded toward the far fence, some traitorous animal part of her relaxed, and then it came back and found her again. At 6:12, she got up. The grass was wet. She registered this only after she was standing in it, barefoot, in a dressing gown with one sleeve inside out, at the place where the fence sagged low enough to see over. The dew came up cold between her toes. The sky was that thin, scraped colour it goes before proper dawn, and the whole street smelled of petrol and bruised green. And there, in the middle of number 14's ragged lawn, in shirt sleeves, was Draco Malfoy, pushing a mower. He was doing it wrong. That was the first thing she noticed, and it derailed her fury for a good 4 seconds. He was pushing it in a spiral from the outside in narrowing rectangles, with the grim shoulders-forward concentration of a man rolling a boulder up a hill. He had cut the same strip twice. There was a wide, unmown island in the middle, where he'd evidently lost his nerve about the geometry. Malfoy. He didn't hear her. Of course he didn't. The machine was making a noise like a small aircraft. Malfoy! He turned. He saw her. He let go of the handle, and the engine died with a shuddering cough, and the silence that dropped over the 2 gardens was so sudden and so total that a blackbird somewhere took offence at it. Granger. It is 6 o'clock in the morning. It's 12 minutes past. Do you know, she said, do you know what a human being requires? Do you know that people sleep? Do you know that in the ordinary run of things, in the world where ordinary people live, 6 in the morning is not a... Words were failing her, which never happened, which happened now with alarming regularity around this man. Nobody mows at 6. He looked at the mower, then at her. Something almost imperceptible crossed his face. A flicker, a recalculation, gone before it could be caught. Noted, he said. Noted? You've registered an objection. I've noted it. That isn't, Malfoy, that isn't an apology. That's minute-taking. Would you prefer an apology? I'd prefer sleep. Then I suggest, he said, picking up the handle again, that you go and get some. The mower roared back into life. Hermione stood there for a full 10 seconds with her mouth open and her feet freezing, and dew soaking the hem of her dressing gown, being comprehensively outmanoeuvred by a man who was cutting his lawn in a spiral. And then she turned and went inside and slammed the kitchen door so hard the glass rattled in its putty. Crookshanks watched her from the top of the fridge with an expression of profound editorial disapproval. Don't, she told him. It became a campaign. That was how she thought of it afterwards, how she catalogued it in a notebook in her small upright hand, because Hermione Granger under siege reverted to method the way water finds a drain. Item 1. The mowing. 6 o'clock every second morning, without deviation, in all weathers. On the 4th occasion, it was actually raining, a fine needling drizzle, and he mowed anyway, hair plastered flat. and she watched him from behind the bedroom curtain with a cup of tea going cold in her hands and thought, nobody mows in the rain. Nobody mows a wet lawn. This is not gardening. This is warfare. Item 2. The newspaper. It began on a Thursday. She came out at 7:30 for The Guardian, which was delivered by a boy on a bicycle at approximately 1:15, and found the doormat bare. She assumed the boy had overslept. On Friday, it happened again. On Saturday, she got up at 7 and stood behind the frosted glass of the front door like a woman staking out a bank. And at 7:19, she saw, through the warped panes, a shape descend out of the pale morning. And by the time she had the door open, there was only a single feather on the step, barred grey and white, and a receding shape over the rooftops, with something rolled and orange-banded in its talons. She was over the fence in her work skirt. "Your bird," she bellowed at the back door of number 14, "is committing theft." The door opened. He was in the middle of shaving. There was foam along his jaw and a towel over one shoulder, and he looked at her with the particular blankness of a man interrupted in a private ritual by a shouting woman standing in his flower bed. "He's an eagle owl. I don't care what species of criminal he is. Then he isn't a bird. He's an owl. Malfoy, he has taken my newspaper 4 days running." Has he? Something went across his face. Not guilt. Not amusement. Something more like a man consulting an internal ledger and finding an entry he'd forgotten to close. He wiped the foam from his jaw with a towel, slowly. "I'll speak to him. You'll speak to him. He's quite reasonable. He is a thief." "He's an owl," said Malfoy. "Thieving is a very small part of what he does. Would you like the paper back? It's on the table." She stared past him. It was, in fact, on the table, folded, uncreased. Beside it, a cup of black coffee and a plate with a single slice of unbuttered toast on it, and the whole scene was so bleak and so tidy that for one appalling half-second she felt something that was not anger at all. "Keep it," she said, and left. Item 3. The tree. He planted it on a Sunday in the corner of his garden nearest her kitchen window, and she watched the entire operation from the sink with her hands in cooling, washing-up water. He dug badly. He dug like a man who had read about digging. It took him an hour and a half to make a hole that any Muggle labourer would have made in 20 minutes, and by the end of it, his shirt was stuck to his back, and there was earth up to his elbows, and he had never once, not for a second, considered using a wand. She noticed that. She filed it somewhere she didn't look at. The sapling was a yew. A yew. She looked it up that evening, out of pure spite, in a battered Muggle gardening encyclopedia she'd bought at a car boot sale. Yew, churchyards. Yew, poison. Every part of it. Bark and leaf and seed. Yew, longbows and death and the wood they cut wands from. She shut the book hard enough to raise dust. "He is planting a graveyard tree in front of my kitchen window," she wrote in the notebook, underlining it twice. "He wants me to look at it every single morning." Item 4. The piano. But that came later, and that was different, and she wasn't ready for it yet. Item 5. The elf. She never saw it properly. That was the maddening part. She saw evidence. A small pair of eyes at the bottom of the hedge, gone the instant she looked. A tea towel that vanished from her line and reappeared 3 days later, washed and pressed and folded into a shape too neat for human hands on her doorstep. her wheelie bin, which she was certain she had left at the bottom of the drive, standing tidily by the side gate when she came home. And Crookshanks. Crookshanks, who had survived a war, a time-turner, and Ron Weasley, came in through the cat flap one evening in a state of such violent indignation that he actually spoke, a long yowling complaint delivered directly to her, front paws planted, ears flat, and she found, tied around his neck in a small, immaculate bow, a length of green ribbon. The next week, it was a bell. The week after that, he came in dragging a knitted mouse the size of a grapefruit and would not surrender it, and slept with it under the radiator for 11 days. "He's taunting my cat," she said aloud to the empty kitchen, in the voice of a woman who could hear how she sounded and could not stop. 3 weeks in, she began to keep a proper record. Dates, times, duration of mowing, occurrences of the owl. She stopped short of photographs only because she couldn't work out how to explain the developing to the man at Boots. Because here was the thing underneath the thing she was very carefully not writing down in the notebook. It was easier. For 11 months she had lived in a house where nothing happened. She had come home at 6:40 and made a meal for one, and read until her eyes hurt and gone to bed. And the silence had been so complete that some nights she had turned the radio on just to have another voice in the room, and then turned it off again because the voices were all discussing things that had happened to other people. She had told herself this was peace. She had defended it fiercely to the small nagging part of herself that said otherwise. This is what you wanted. No one needs you. Nothing is your fault. Nothing is anyone's fault. Nothing is anything. And then a man had moved in next door and started cutting his grass at dawn. And now she woke up with her heart going. And it turned out this was the shameful part. This was the part she would have died before admitting. That having something to be furious about was the most alive she had felt since the war ended. She had an enemy. Enemies were simple. Enemies were a shape she knew how to hold. She was standing at the kitchen window one evening in late September, thinking exactly none of this in any conscious way, watching the last of the light go copper on the roof slates of number 14, when she saw him come out into his garden. He had a watering can. He went to the yew that was going to make her look at death every morning of her life, and he watered it, carefully, all the way round, the way you're supposed to, which meant he had looked it up. Then he stood there. He didn't do anything. He didn't move. He stood in the failing light with the can hanging from one hand and looked at the sapling and then past it, at the low sagging fence. And then, for a moment so brief she could have invented it, at the lit rectangle of her kitchen window. Hermione stepped back from the glass so fast she caught her hip on the corner of the table. By the time she made herself look again, he'd gone in, and the garden was empty, and the yew stood there in the blue dusk with its roots in 6 inches of watered earth, 3 feet tall and absurdly small, planted by a man who had spent an hour and a half digging a hole he could have made in 1 second. She went to the notebook. She opened it to item 3. She read what she'd written, and she picked up her pen to add the date of the watering, and she sat with the nib touching the paper for a long moment without writing anything at all, because a thought had arrived, uninvited and entirely unwelcome. and it was standing in the middle of her mind, refusing to leave. Why would a man taunting me bother to learn how to keep the tree alive? The piano started on the 8th of October at 10 minutes past 2 in the morning. She had been asleep, properly asleep, the deep kind that had come back to her only in the last year and still felt like a borrowed coat. And she surfaced out of it slowly this time, not with the old jolt, but by degrees, the way you wake when something is not an alarm but a question. The wall behind her bed was a party wall. The houses on Wisteria Lane were semi-detached, built in 1936 by a firm that had gone bankrupt in 1938, and the plaster between number 12 and number 14 was, she had long suspected, mostly optimism. She had never minded. Mrs. Dunhill had been 91 and deaf, and had spent the last 2 years of her life watching television at a volume that made the light fittings hum, and Hermione had found it almost companionable. This was not television. It came through the plaster the way water comes through a ceiling, not loud, but everywhere at once, in the frame of the bed and the floorboards and the small glass of water on the nightstand, where a tremor moved across the surface in fine concentric rings. Piano. Slow. In a minor key she couldn't name. She lay still and let the fury assemble itself. It took longer than usual. She had to build it deliberately, brick by brick. 2 in the morning, 2 in the morning. He knows exactly what he's doing. This is item 6. This is the worst one yet. And she got herself up on one elbow and then out of bed. And she was reaching for the dressing gown on the back of the door with her jaw set and a speech already half drafted when the music stopped. Not ended. Stopped. In the middle of a phrase, on a note that wanted to go somewhere and hadn't been allowed to. The silence afterwards had a torn edge to it. Then it began again, a few bars back, and came forward and arrived at the same place, and stumbled and stopped. Hermione stood with the dressing gown in her hand. Again, back a little further this time. The same slow climb, the same left hand walking underneath it, and she could hear him now, not as a noise, but as a person. Hear the small hesitation as he approached the difficult bar. Hear him try to take it faster to get through it. Hear it go wrong in a slightly different way. Hear him stop. The house was very cold. The radiator had gone off at midnight, and the window frames on this side always let a thread of air through no matter what she stuffed into them. And she stood in the dark on the strip of carpet by the door and listened to a man fail at the same 8 notes for 25 minutes. Nobody does that to annoy a neighbour. That was the trouble. That was the whole trouble in a single sentence, arriving at 2:30 in the morning, uninvited, like every important thought she'd ever had. Nobody torments an enemy by making a mistake in private, over and over, and then correcting it in private, and then making it again. There was no audience in this. There was no cruelty in it. There was only a person alone in a room in the middle of the night doing something difficult very badly because he could not do the other thing, which was sleep. She knew that particular arithmetic. She had done her own version of it for 2 years. The reading until 4, the reorganizing of shelves, the Muggle crossword done in pen so that it took longer. Hermione put the dressing gown back on the hook. She got into bed and pulled the blankets up to her chin and lay in the dark with her eyes open. And through the wall the phrase came again and again, and on the 11th attempt it went through, the whole passage, unbroken into whatever came after it, which was quieter and slower and unbearably tender. And she found herself holding her breath as though she'd been the one playing. He stopped after that. She heard, through the plaster, the small, definite sound of a lid being lowered. She did not sleep for another hour, and she spent the entire hour furious. And it was not until she was folding herself into the corner of the 8:14 train the following morning, with the Guardian on her knees, recovered, unread, that she was able to identify what she was actually furious about. He hadn't known she could hear. She said nothing about it. That was the strategy she arrived at, sitting at her desk at Whitlow and Pierce, with a mug of tea going scummy at her elbow. She would say nothing, and she would give no ground, and she would certainly not mention the wall. The strategy survived 4 days. On the 5th day, it rained. Not drizzle, but the real thing. A hammering October downpour that came in sideways off the downs and turned the gutters of Wisteria Lane into small brown rivers. And Hermione came home from a viewing in Petersfield at 7:10, soaked to the shoulders, with a bag of shopping that had begun to disintegrate somewhere around the corner of Cranbourne Street. She saw the light in his kitchen. She saw the shape of him moving behind the streaming glass. And she saw, at the bottom of her own drive, standing on the pavement with the rain sluicing off its lid, her wheelie bin, which she had not put out, because it was Wednesday, because collection was Thursday, and she had left it at the side of the house that morning, like a rational adult. And now it was down at the curb, squarely aligned, exactly where it needed to be, for a lorry that came at 6:30 in the morning while she was still asleep. The bag gave out. 4 apples went into the gutter and floated off in convoy. She stood in the rain and watched them go, and something in her chest went very tight and very hot, and she was over the low wall between the 2 drives before she had made any decision at all, banging on the back door of number 14 with the flat of her hand. He opened it. Rain came in past her, spattering the tiles. "Granger!" "You moved my bin." "I did." He stepped back. Not away, sideways, an opening of the doorway, a gesture so unconsidered that it took her a moment to understand she had been invited in out of the weather. "Come in. You're flooding my floor." "I don't want to come in." "You very obviously do." "I want to know why you moved my bin." "Because it's Thursday tomorrow." He said it in the voice of a man stating that fire is hot. "The lorry comes at 6:35. If it isn't at the curb, they leave it, and then it's a fortnight." "You've timed the lorry." "It comes at 6:35, he repeated. And there was, she would swear to it later, she would examine the memory the way one worries a loose tooth, the faintest thread of defensiveness under it. The rain drummed on the flat roof of the extension. She was standing in the doorway with her hair flat to her skull and water running out of her sleeve, holding the ruined remains of a shopping bag, and behind him the kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and, absurdly, of wood smoke. "Malfoy." Her voice came out lower than she'd meant. "Why are you doing all this?" "All what?" "The bin, the tree, the—" She stopped, because the next item on the list was the newspaper my owl returns folded, and the one after that was the ribbon on my cat, and saying them aloud in sequence made them sound like something quite different from a campaign of harassment. You mow at 6 in the morning. Yes. Why? He looked at her. And for a fraction of a second, half a heartbeat, no more, something surfaced in his face that she had never once seen there in 12 years of knowing him. It was not scorn, and it was not amusement, and it was not the flat grey shutter he had been wearing since September. It was closer to the expression of a man asked a question in an examination he had prepared for very thoroughly, and now, on the day, could not remember a single answer to. "Because that's when it's done," he said. "That is not an answer. It's the answer I have. It's nonsense. Granger." He put a hand on the doorframe. His knuckles stood out pale against the painted wood. "Your shopping is in the gutter." She turned. 2 of the apples had made it as far as the drain. When she turned back, he was holding out a tea towel. It was a perfectly ordinary tea towel. It was white with a blue stripe, and it had been washed and pressed into a rectangle of such geometric severity that she recognized the folding instantly. She had seen it before, on her own doorstep, wrapped around her own missing towel 3 weeks earlier, and the recognition went through her like a struck note. She took it. Her fingers brushed his. Neither of them moved. It was the smallest possible contact, 2 knuckles and the edge of a palm, half a second at most, and she felt the whole surface of her skin come awake in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. There was a pull in the air of that doorway, a low, steady drag like the pressure that builds before thunder, and she was suddenly and horribly aware of the sound of her own breathing. He drew his hand back first, carefully, the way a man withdraws from something he has been told not to touch. 6:35, he said. "Don't be late with the bin." And he shut the door. That night, she did not sleep, and at 2:10 the piano started, and Hermione Granger lay in the dark of a house she had bought in order to be nobody, with a folded tea towel on the chair beside her bed, listening to a man she had hated for half her life fail at 8 notes on the other side of a plaster wall. She thought about the mowing, 6 in the morning, every second day in the rain. She thought about a house in Wiltshire where the lawns were kept by things that were not paid for it, and where nobody had ever needed to know when a bin went out, or what a lorry was, or how deep to dig a hole for a tree. He's never lived next to anybody in his life, she thought. And then, riding in on the back of it before she could bar the door, he's trying. She sat up so fast the blankets went off the bed. "No," she said aloud, to the dark, to the wall, to the whole preposterous shape of the idea. "No, absolutely not. He's a menace, and I have a notebook." Through the plaster, the phrase climbed and stumbled and stopped. She got up. She stood in the middle of the cold room with her arms wrapped round herself, and she looked at the wall, at the faded roses on the wallpaper, at the hairline crack running down from the picture rail, at the 6 inches of 1936 optimism that was the only thing standing between her and the answer to every question she had asked in the last month. Then she lifted her hand and, quite deliberately, knocked twice. The piano stopped. The silence went on for so long that she began to feel every degree of the cold, every hair on her arms, the entire ridiculous fact of herself standing barefoot at 2:30, knocking on a wall like a lunatic. Then, from the other side, very quietly, 2 knocks back. The mowing did not stop, but it moved. She noticed it on the following Tuesday, in the way one notices an absence rather than an event. She woke at 7:10 on her own, with the light already grey and honest at the edges of the curtains, and lay for a moment in the unfamiliar peace of a room in which nothing had gone wrong. Then, at 9:30, while she was standing at the sink in her coat with a slice of toast in her mouth, the engine started. 9:30 on a Saturday. She did not go to the window. She stood with her back to it and finished the toast and washed the plate and did not go to the window. And when she left the house at 10, she took the front door and walked down the drive with her eyes fixed on the gate, and did not look at number 14 at all. And her face was doing something she was extremely glad nobody could see. The notebook stayed in the drawer that week. She told herself it was because she was busy. The flu took her on the Thursday. It began as a scratch at the back of the throat on Wednesday evening, the kind of thing she would ordinarily have ignored, and by Thursday lunchtime she was sitting at her desk at Whitlow and Pierce, with her hands wrapped round a mug she could not feel the heat of, reading the same sentence of a lease agreement 4 times and understanding none of it. Sandra from Lettings took one look at her and said, "Go home, love. You look like a Tuesday in February." And Hermione, who had once run 3 miles through a burning forest with a splinter of bone in her forearm, said that she was perfectly fine, and then stood up and had to hold the edge of the desk. She got the 2:40. She remembered very little of it. What she remembered afterwards, in fragments, was this: the front door taking 3 attempts, the coldness of the hall floor tiles through her shoes, the stairs, which had become an alpine event, her own bed reached at last, and the specific and total relief of horizontality. And then the fever came up out of the mattress like water rising in a lock, and the room began to go. There was no pepper up. That was the thought that circled and circled, coming around again each time she surfaced. There was no pepper up, and no blood replenishing, and no Madame Pomfrey, and no Molly Weasley with a tray, and no fussing, no hands on her forehead, no one sitting in the chair by the bed with a book they weren't reading. There was a house and a cat and a packet of Muggle paracetamol somewhere in the kitchen that she had bought in June and could not now reach. And there was nobody in the world who was going to notice that she had not come out of this room. She had wanted that. She had built it deliberately, with both hands. It had taken 11 months of careful, patient construction. At some point in the night, she began to shake so hard that the headboard knocked against the wall, and she thought, with a lucidity that felt almost peaceful, "This is what it costs." Friday she did not go downstairs at all. She knew this only from the light. The light came and stood in the corner of the room and lay down and went away again. Crookshanks arrived at some point and settled against her hip with the immovable weight of a small orange sandbag, and she put her hand into his fur and left it there because it was the only warm thing in the house. Friday night, the piano did not play. She noticed, even through it, even with her hair stuck to her forehead and her joints aching in a way that felt medieval. She noticed the wall being silent and some small, delirious part of her was aggrieved about it. Saturday morning, there was a knock at the front door. She heard it from a great distance. She did not move. It came again and then stopped, and she let herself sink back down into the grey. The second knock was at the back door, and it was different. 3 raps, hard, with the flat of a hand rather than knuckles, the sound of someone who had been standing outside for a while making a decision. Then silence. Then, unmistakably and impossibly, the sound of her own kitchen door opening. Hermione's eyes came open. Every instinct she had, the old ones, the ones that had been laid down in a tent and a manor cellar and never once removed, hauled her up onto her elbows in a lurch that turned the room over twice. Her hand went to the bedside table. Her fingers closed on the paperback about the Napoleonic Wars. It was, she understood distantly, going to be a very poor showing. Downstairs, footsteps on the tiles. A pause. The sound of a bag being set on the table. Then nothing at all for a long time. She lay half-propped in the wreck of the bed with the book in her fist, listening to a man move around her kitchen. She heard a cupboard opened and closed. Another. She heard the tap run. She heard, quite distinctly, the small metallic clatter of a saucepan being taken off the hook by the cooker. And then a long silence. And then a mutter, a single syllable too low to catch, in a voice she would have known anywhere. Crookshanks lifted his head, listened, and put it down again with the air of a cat who considered the matter under control. She must have gone under, because when she came up, the light had shifted, and there was a smell in the house. It was not, objectively, a good smell. It had a scorched edge to it. But it was hot food, and it was in her house, and she had not eaten since Wednesday, and the animal in her sat up and turned toward it before the rest of her could file an objection. The footsteps came to the bottom of the stairs, and stopped. She lay very still, and listened to a man standing at the foot of a staircase for what felt like a full minute. She could hear him not coming up. She could hear the entire negotiation of it, the weight shifting on the bottom step, the decision, the reversal. And then the footsteps went back down the hall, and there was the sound of something being set down, and then the back door, and then the small dry click of the latch. Hermione got out of bed at 4 in the afternoon by means of a staged campaign involving the wall, the door frame, the banister, and one moment of pure faith at the turn of the stairs. On the kitchen table there was a saucepan with the lid on. Inside it, soup. Chicken, evidently, though the chicken had been cut by someone with no clear theory of what a piece of chicken ought to be. There were carrots in coins of wildly various thickness. There was far too much barley, which had swollen and gone claggy, and the bottom of the pan had a brown skin on it where something had caught. Beside the pan stood a glass of water, a box of paracetamol still in its cellophane, and a second glass with a spoon standing in it, because the person who had laid this out had evidently not been certain which vessel a spoon went in. There was no note. There was, instead, on the corner of the table, a single sheet of good cream paper, and on it, in a small, sharp hand, with an old-fashioned lean to it, "Sunday it rains after 2. Don't hang anything out." That was all. No signature, no greeting, a weather report. Hermione sat down on a kitchen chair very suddenly because her legs had stopped participating, and she looked at that sheet of paper for a long time. He had come into her house. He had stood in her kitchen and worked out where she kept the saucepans by opening every cupboard, and he had made, badly, patiently, entirely by hand, the only thing anyone had ever brought her when she was ill. He had put out a spoon and not known where to put it. He had walked to the bottom of the stairs and stopped, because going up them would have been an intrusion, and coming into the house at all had already cost him something she could not calculate. And then, because he could not sign it and could not say it, and had no template in his life for any sentence that began "I was worried," he had told her about the rain. The soup was lukewarm. She ate all of it, standing at the counter out of the pan with the spoon that had been left in a glass, and halfway through she made a sound that was not entirely a laugh and had to put the pan down and hold on to the edge of the sink. Nobody knew I was ill, she thought. Nobody in the entire world knew I was ill. He knew by Thursday, which meant he had been watching her house, which meant she followed it step by step with the terrible thoroughness that was the only thing about herself she had never been able to give up, that he had noticed the kitchen light not going on at 6:30, that he had noticed the bin not going out, that the piano had been silent on Friday night because a man on the other side of 6 inches of plaster had understood that someone was trying to sleep through a fever. She looked at the wall. The knock came on Sunday evening at the front door at 7. She had been up since noon. She had washed her hair, which had felt like an expedition, and put on actual clothes and eaten 2 slices of toast, and she was sitting in the front room with a blanket over her knees and the fire on and the scrubbed pan on the hearth beside her, waiting in a state of tension she had declined to name. She opened the door. He was standing on the step with his hands in his coat pockets and his collar up against the cold, and he did not smile, and he did not look at her directly for the first second and a half. "You're vertical," he said. "Apparently. Good." The silence came down. Behind him, the street was blue dark and glazed with rain. It had, in fact, rained after 2, and the street lamp at the end of the drive threw a long wet stripe up the pavement. Malfoy. She had rehearsed this. She had rehearsed it 4 separate ways, and every one of them had just gone out of her head. "You came into my house." The door was unlocked. "That isn't a defense. That's an aggravating factor. Are you going to report me?" "I'm going to thank you," she said, and watched it land on him like something thrown. He went absolutely still. Not the stillness of composure, the other kind, the kind that happens when a person is hit somewhere they had no guard up and has to spend a moment deciding what their face is going to do about it. His hand came out of his pocket and settled on the door frame, and the knuckles went white against the paintwork, and he looked past her shoulder into the hall as though the hall had asked him a question. "It was inedible," he said. "It was terrible. There was a bone in it." "There was a bone in the chicken." "Yes, Malfoy, there was. That's rather the point of chicken. You're meant to remove—" She stopped. She held the door frame on her own side. Her heart was going in a way that had nothing whatever to do with a fever. "It was the best thing anybody has done for me in 2 years. The rain ticked in the gutter. He looked at her then, properly, and whatever he had been holding in place all autumn slipped a fraction and did not entirely go back. "Granger," he said very quietly, "there's a bag of shopping on your step. I didn't know what you eat." November came in with fog. It lay along Wisteria Lane in the mornings, like something settling in for a long stay, softening the parked cars into suggestions, muffling the sound of the 8:14 until the trains seemed to arrive from another county. Hermione walked to the station through it with her scarf up over her chin and her breath going out in pale rags. And she found that she was. There was no other word for it, however much she disliked the word. Content. The bag of shopping had contained a loaf of bread, a jar of honey, 6 eggs, a tin of soup with the price sticker still on it from the Spar on the corner, and a bar of chocolate of a brand that had not existed since 1979, and which she was fairly certain he had ordered specially from somewhere in Diagon Alley without thinking about it. She had eaten the chocolate over 4 evenings, in small pieces, and had not analysed why she was rationing it. They did not become friends. That would have been a betrayal of something on both sides. But the war changed character. When the mower started on a Saturday morning, she opened the window and shouted a correction about the spiral. "You go up and down, Malfoy, in strips, like a normal person. That's why it looks like a crop circle." And he shouted back that the machine was defective. And the following week, the lawn had stripes in it, wobbling and unequal. And she stood at the sink for a full minute, looking at them with her hand over her mouth. When the owl took her paper, she began leaving the previous days on the wall between the drives, folded, weighted with a stone. The owl took that instead. She never saw it happen. It simply went, and the current day's paper stayed on her mat, and neither of them ever mentioned the arrangement. And at night, through the plaster, the piano played. It was better now. He had got through the passage that had defeated him in October and moved on to something else, longer and stranger. And there were still nights when it stopped mid-phrase and went back and stopped again, but they were fewer. She had stopped resenting it entirely. She had begun, without at any point deciding to, timing her reading to it, putting the book down when the lid came down. Twice more she had knocked twice on the wall at the end. Twice he had knocked back. Crookshanks vanished on the 3rd of December. She realised at 9:30 at night. He had not come in for his food, which was unprecedented. Crookshanks regarded meals as a matter of contract law. She checked the airing cupboard, the space behind the sofa, the shed. She went up and down the lane, calling his name in the fog with a torch, past the parked cars and the wheelie bins and the lit curtains of people who had normal lives, and got as far as the post box at the corner before she had to stop and stand still for a moment, because her chest had gone tight in a way she recognized and did not want. "It is a cat," she told herself. "He is 19 years old, and he is a cat, and this is what happens." It didn't help. It never helped saying the true thing. He had been under her jumper in a tent in the Forest of Dean. He had been on her bed in the fever in October. He was the last living creature that had known her before. She was back at her own gate at 11:10, hoarse, when she heard the sound. It came from the other side of the fence, a small, high, distressed sound, not a cat's. And then a clatter, and then a whisper, urgent and pleading, in a voice she knew the shape of instantly, even though she had never heard this particular one. Hermione went over the fence. She did not go round. She put her hands on the top rail of the sagging panel and swung a leg over it in her work coat, and came down on the other side in wet grass, and her torch beam went swinging across the garden of number 14, across the mown stripes, silver with dew, across the little yew, taller now than it had been, its branches holding the fog in tiny beads, and into the open door of the greenhouse. 2 enormous eyes flared green in the light. The elf froze. It was tiny, smaller than Dobby had been, and older, with ears that hung rather than stood, and a face folded like a dropped handkerchief. And it was wearing what was unmistakably a pillowcase, but a pillowcase that had been carefully hemmed and cut to fit and pressed. It had a saucer in one hand, and curled on a sack of potting compost, entirely unrepentant, with a green ribbon round his neck and his front paws tucked under him, was Crookshanks. "Oh," said Hermione. And then, because her voice did something at the end of it she hadn't authorized, "Oh, you absolute article." The elf made a sound like a kettle. "No, no, wait, please." The torch was on the ground. She was on her knees in the wet grass with her hands up, palms out, the way you approach something that has decided you are the danger. "I'm not going to. Please don't go. Please. I've been out there for 2 hours. The elf did not go. It stood in the doorway of the greenhouse, trembling from the ears down, clutching the saucer to its chest with both hands, and looked at her with an expression of such total catastrophe that Hermione understood with a lurch that it expected to be punished. "Nobody is angry," she said very quietly. "What's your name?" "Fenwick, miss." The voice was a splinter of a thing. "Fenwick is not to be seen, miss. Fenwick is particularly not to be seen by you, miss. And Fenwick has been seen, and now Fenwick has ruined it." "Ruined what?" The elf's mouth clamped shut so hard its whole face crumpled. Hermione sat back on her heels in the grass. The fog moved past the greenhouse in slow drifts. Somewhere at the end of the lane, a car went by, its tires hissing. "Fenwick," she said, "why are you not to be seen by me?" Because Master says. Misery. Absolute misery. Master says Miss Granger has left all of it behind, miss. Master says Miss Granger has gone to live where there is no magic in it, and that is Miss Granger's own choosing, and it is not for us to be putting it back through her window. A sniff. So Fenwick does not do the spells where Miss Granger can see. Fenwick does the bins by hand. Fenwick carries the coal thing, miss, the black bag by hand, and it is very heavy. And Master says that is how it is done here, and we must do it their way. Something moved in Hermione's chest, slowly, like furniture being shifted in a room upstairs. "He's been doing everything by hand," she said. "Because of me. Master does not use the wand outside, miss. Not once. Not in the garden. Not for the digging. Not even when he is putting the tree in and his hands are bleeding. And Fenwick says, 'Let Fenwick.' And Master says, 'No, Fenwick. She will see the ground move.' The tree." Her mouth had gone dry. "Fenwick, the yew. Why a yew?" The elf looked up, and for the first time its face uncrumpled slightly, because here at last was a question it could answer. "Miss said the fence was bare." "I never—" "Miss said it to the postman, miss." Fenwick blinked. "In September," Fenwick heard. "Miss said, It's such a shame. There's nothing green along that side. It's all just fence. And Master was at the window, and afterwards Master goes into the town and comes back with 3 books about the trees. And he reads them all night. Miss, all of them. And he says the yew is the one that keeps its green through the winter and does not die, and it will grow, and it will still be growing in 400 years. The fog came in through the greenhouse door in a slow, pale coil. Hermione put a hand flat on the cold grass to steady herself. "The mowing," she said. "Fenwick, the mowing at 6 in the morning." "Ah." The elf's ears drooped further, if that were possible. "That is the book, miss." "What book?" "The Considerate Neighbour, a practical handbook for suburban life." Fenwick recited it in the voice of an elf who had heard the title a great many times. "Master buys it from the shop with the second-hand ones, miss. It is from 1961. It says, Fenwick has heard Master read it out. It says that the well-mannered gentleman attends to noisy garden tasks early in the day, so as not to intrude upon his neighbour's evening leisure." Hermione heard distantly herself make a sound. "He got up at 6 in the morning, in the rain, in October." She pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes. "Because a book from 1961 told him it was polite. Master was very anxious to do it correctly, miss. And the newspaper, Fenwick, the owl, that is Master also." The elf turned the saucer round and round in its hands. "Miss carries the shopping and the case and the paper up the drive all together, and one time in October the paper drops in the wet, miss, and Master sees. And afterwards he sends Perseus to fetch it before the wet gets to it. He puts it on the table until Miss is home, and then he—" Fenwick stopped, appalled. "Then he what?" "Then he irons it, miss," said Fenwick wretchedly, "so it does not look like an owl has had it." Hermione Granger sat down properly in the wet grass of Draco Malfoy's garden at 11:20 on a night in December, and put both hands over her face, and made a noise that started as a laugh and did not stay one. Every item, every single item in that notebook, catalogued in her small upright hand, underlined and dated and cross-referenced. The bin at the curb because the lorry came at 6:35, and he had stood at a window and timed it. The tea towel taken from her line and returned because it had been on the ground, and he could not bring himself to leave it there. The ribbon on the cat, the bell, the knitted mouse the size of a grapefruit. "He's doing it deliberately," she had written 3 times in 3 different colours of ink. And he had been. That was the joke. That was the whole vast, unbearable joke of it. He had been doing every last piece of it deliberately, with enormous effort in the wrong century, from a manual, hoping she would notice, hoping she would not notice it was him. "Fenwick." Her voice was not steady. "Is he in?" "Master is in the front room, miss. Master does not sleep." A pause. "Master has not slept properly since—" The elf stopped. "Since when?" Fenwick looked at the floor of the greenhouse. "Since the trial, miss," it said. "And it is worse in this house, because in this house the wall is thin, and Master says he must not play at night, because Miss Granger has to be up early, and then at 2 in the morning he goes and plays anyway, and afterwards he is angry with himself for hours." Hermione stood up. Her knees were soaked through, and her hands were freezing, and her chest was doing something complicated and painful. and she reached down and gathered up 19 pounds of extremely aggrieved orange cat, who submitted with the air of a creature who had been trying to arrange this meeting for months. "Fenwick," she said, "you've done nothing wrong. Do you understand me? Nothing." "Fenwick has been seen, miss." "Yes." She settled Crookshanks against her shoulder. Down the side of the house, through the black shape of the passage, a lit window threw a long gold rectangle onto the fog. "Yes, you have. And now I'm going to go and see him." He opened the door with a book in his hand. That was the detail she kept afterwards, out of everything. Not his face, not the first thing either of them said, but the fact that Draco Malfoy answered his own back door at 11:25 at night, holding a battered orange-spined paperback with a cracked spine, one finger still marking his place, as though she had interrupted something. He took in the state of her in a single downward sweep, the wet knees, the mud on her coat, the torch in her fist, the enormous cat riding on her shoulder with a green ribbon round his neck. Then he looked past her, at the fog, at the dark shape of the greenhouse with its door standing open. "Ah," he said, "yes. He's terrified of people. He was very brave." Hermione's voice came out with a crack in the middle of it. "He told me everything." Something went out of Malfoy's shoulders. Not relief, the opposite, the particular slackening of a man who has been braced against a wall that has just been removed and now has nothing to lean on. "Right," he said. "Are you going to let me in?" "No." "Malfoy, you're going to say something," he said, "and I would rather you said it out here, where I can shut the door." The fog moved in slow coils between them, catching the light from the kitchen and going gold at the edges of it. Crookshanks, who had no interest whatsoever in the emotional architecture of the moment, poured himself off her shoulder and went past Malfoy's legs into the warmth of the house with his tail up. "The considerate neighbour," said Hermione. 1961. His jaw went tight. "Fenwick talks too much. He said you read it out loud. He said a great deal too much. You have been getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning," she said, "and standing in the rain, pushing a lawnmower in a spiral, because a book printed before either of us was born told you that a well-mannered gentleman attends to noisy tasks early so as not to disturb his neighbour's evening leisure. It's a perfectly sound principle. It is a catastrophic principle, Malfoy. It is the single most inconsiderate thing a human being can do to another human being. In this country, in this century, people would rather you burned their house down. Then the book," he said, with great dignity, "is wrong." "Yes. I have no way of knowing that." It came out sharper than he'd meant. She watched him hear it. His hand tightened on the doorframe, and the knuckles went pale under the skin. "Do you understand? I had no way of knowing that. I have never in my life lived within 100 yards of another household. I have never posted a letter. I did not know that bins are collected, or that they are collected on a particular day, or that a man comes to read a meter, or that there is a correct hour at which one may cut grass. Everything I know about being ordinary I have taken out of second-hand books, because there is no one alive I can ask without it becoming a story in a newspaper." The gutter ticked. Somewhere off in the fog, a train went through without stopping. "You could have asked me," said Hermione. He laughed. It was a short, awful, entirely unamused sound. Could I? Yes. You went white when you saw my hair over the fence. His voice had dropped, and the drop was worse than volume. You reached for a wand that isn't there. In the first 4 minutes you told me to sell the house and leave the county, and you would like me to believe that I could have knocked on your door and said, "Granger, I don't know how the rubbish works. Would you teach me?" She opened her mouth. Nothing came. "Precisely," he said. "So, instead, you decided to be helpful in secret." Her own voice was rising, and she couldn't stop it. "You had your owl steal my paper. Return it." He returns it. "You put my bin out at midnight. You had a house elf carrying coal by hand because you were afraid I'd see magic through the window. You dug a hole for 2 hours with your bare hands until they bled. Fenwick told me, don't do that with your face. And you never once, not once in 3 months, said a single word about any of it. Why? Because it's worth nothing if it's said." He hurled it at her and then stood there looking as shocked as she was. "It's worth nothing, Granger. A favour announced is a debt. I know precisely what that is. I was raised inside it. Every kindness in my father's house came with an invoice attached, and I could not—" His hand went off the doorframe and made a short, violent motion in the air and stopped. "I could not do that to you, so it had to be nothing. It had to look like nothing. A tree is just a tree. A bin is just a bin. Then you owe nobody anything, and you can go on living exactly as you like, and nothing has been put back through your window." The fog stood between them. She could feel her heartbeat in the palms of her hands. "Fenwick used those words," she said. "Almost exactly." "Fenwick," said Malfoy, "will be found new employment on a remote island. You said I'd left it behind. All of it." "You had." "Yes. So I left it behind too." He said it flatly, as though reporting weather. "Outside the house. No wand in the garden. It isn't a sacrifice. Don't look like that. I have very little use for it these days. And it seemed—" He stopped, and for the first time in the entire conversation, he looked away from her, out into the fog, at the sagging fence between their 2 properties. It seemed indecent to be doing it 6 feet away from you, like eating in front of somebody who can't. Hermione put her hand out and took hold of the door frame because she needed something. "Do you know what I've been doing since September?" she said. "I've been keeping a notebook." "A what?" "A notebook. Dated entries. Item 1, the mowing. Item 2, the newspaper. Item 3, the tree. Deliberate, note the associations. Churchyards, poison, wands." She watched his face change. "I looked up the U in a Muggle encyclopedia to prove you were threatening me with a symbol." "It was on offer at the garden centre," said Malfoy faintly. "It keeps its green through the winter and does not die." He shut his eyes. "Fenwick," he said, "is going to be found employment in the sea." And then Hermione Granger began to laugh, and it went wrong almost immediately, because it turned out that there was something underneath the laughing that had been waiting 11 months for a crack to come out of. And it came out of this one. She stood in the fog on a doorstep with her hand over her mouth, shaking, making a sound that was no longer funny at all. And when he moved, a single step, one hand half lifting, she said, Don't. I'm all right. I'm not. I'm all right." "You're evidently not." "I sold you the house." "Yes." I signed 41 contracts in March, and I never once read the names on them, because names were the part of the job that could find me, and I sold you the house next door to mine and used the commission to buy a boiler. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist, roughly. Do you know what I thought when I saw you? I thought, they've sent someone. I thought, 11 months, and it's over, they've found me, and it's going to start again. The letters, the questions, Miss Granger, some of us think you have a duty. Granger. And it wasn't them. It was you. It was you buying a house with a south wall because nobody there asks questions. Her breath went out of her raggedly. We ran to the same place, Malfoy. That's the joke. That's the entire joke. We ran in opposite directions as fast as we could go, and we arrived at the same fence. He was very still. Why did you stop? He asked. The magic. You've never said, and I've never asked, and I'm asking. The fog crawled along the pavement. Behind him, in the warm gold of the kitchen, Crookshanks had got up onto the table, which was going to be a problem for someone later. Because every time I picked it up, she said slowly, somebody needed saving. He didn't move. That's what it was for. That's all it was ever for. I learned it because Harry was going to die if I didn't. And then I kept learning it because somebody else was going to die if I didn't. And then the war finished, and I went into the ministry, and it was still that. The elves, the werewolf legislation, the Muggle-born registry files, the reparations. And every single time I put my hand out, somebody said, "Thank Merlin you're here, Hermione. Nobody else could have done it." And I'd think, yes, that's right. Nobody else can, so I'd better not stop. Her voice was very quiet. And then there was the business with the Wizengamot minutes and the letters that got read out. And suddenly, I was a scandal instead of a symbol. And the same people who had said nobody else could do it stopped writing to me within a fortnight. And I sat in my flat in Islington for 4 days, and I discovered that I had absolutely no idea who I was when nobody needed anything. She looked up at him. So, I got rid of it, not to punish it, because I couldn't hold a wand without holding all of that as well. And here, nobody in this street knows my name, Malfoy. Nobody expects anything of me at all. And for 11 months, I thought that was the same thing as being free. And now? Now, a man mows his lawn at 6 in the morning to be polite to me, she said. And my cat is wearing a ribbon, and I ate soup with a bone in it, and I have not felt this. She stopped. Say it, said Malfoy. No. Granger, you say something. She was almost whispering. You've done 3 months of it without saying a word. Say one thing out loud. 1. The air between them had gone dense as water. She was aware of the cold on her wet knees and the smell of the fog. Wet brick, dead leaves, a distant coal fire. And of the fact that he had come 1 step out of the doorway at some point without either of them noticing, and that the distance between them was now nothing at all. He lifted his hand. He did it slowly, the way he had reached into his coat on the first morning, openly, giving her every chance to move. And she did not move. His fingers touched the side of her jaw, where the wet had run down from her hair, and the contact went through her like a struck wire. A fine, hot shock that emptied her head completely. I have counted the days you don't come home before dark, he said, very low. I know which train you take. I know that you sing when you wash up and stop the instant you notice. I have learned the collection times of a refuse lorry as though it was sacred text. I have read a book from 1961 40 times. His thumb moved once along her cheekbone. You asked me why I didn't sell the house. I told you it was because I'd paid for it. Yes, that was a lie. The fog turned slowly around the street lamp. Neither of them was breathing properly. And then, from inside the house, there came an enormous crash of crockery, and Crookshanks shot out of the door between their legs at approximately 40 miles an hour, and Fenwick's voice rose from the kitchen in a wail of pure horror. "Master, the cat is in the dresser." Malfoy's hand fell away. "I'll kill it," he said hoarsely. "You will not. I will kill it, and then I will kill the elf, and then—" He stopped. He looked at her, and she watched him make himself say it. "Granger, come in, please." She went in. The kitchen of number 14 was warm in a way her own house had never once managed, and it smelled of coffee grounds and wood smoke and the particular dust that comes off old books. Half a dresser's worth of crockery lay on the floor in pieces. Fenwick stood in the middle of the wreckage with a dustpan and an expression of apocalyptic guilt, and Crookshanks observed proceedings from the top of a bookcase with the serenity of a cat who has never in his life been responsible for anything. "Leave it," said Malfoy. "Master, the plates." "Leave it, Fenwick. Go to bed." The elf looked from him to Hermione and back again, and something crossed its ruined little face that might have been comprehension, and it vanished with a sound like a cork coming out of a bottle. Then they were alone in a warm kitchen with broken china on the floor, and neither of them knew what to do with their hands. "Sit," he said. "I'll make tea. I can make tea. It's the only thing in the entire domestic canon I have completely mastered." She sat. She watched him fill the kettle at the tap and set it on the hob and take down 2 cups that did not match. And she noticed that his hands were not quite steady, and that he noticed her noticing, and turned slightly so that his back was to her. They talked until 3 in the morning. Not about the thing. Neither of them touched the thing. It sat in the middle of the table between them like a covered dish, and they went carefully round it, and it was there in every word they said. They talked about the book from 1961, which she made him fetch, and which turned out to contain a chapter on the correct way to greet a neighbour's wife that reduced her to a state so helpless she had to put her forehead on the table. They talked about the yew. They talked about the piano, my grandmother's. It's the only thing from the house I asked for. And about the passage in October that had cost him 11 attempts. And she confessed to the knocking on the wall, and he said, "I know." "Why do you think I stopped?" And neither of them said anything for a while after that. At 3:30, she said she should go, and stood up and did not go. At 3:45, he walked her to the fence, though there was a perfectly good gate, and she went over it the way she had come, and he stood on his side of the sagging panel with his hands in his pockets and watched her walk up her own garden through the fog. "Granger." She turned at the door. 6 o'clock is Tuesday, he said. "I could move it to 10. Move it to 10. Right. Malfoy." "Yes." "Don't move it to 10. She had her hand on the latch. Her heart was somewhere up near her collarbone. "I've got rather used to it." The journalist came on the 17th of December. Hermione came up the drive at 6:20 in the dark, with her scarf undone and a bag of shopping in each hand, and there was a woman standing under the street lamp at the end of the path, in a good coat with a notebook already open, and Hermione knew, before a word was said, before she saw the quill hovering ready at shoulder height, the quill that no Muggle could see, exactly what was about to happen to her life. Miss Granger, Sylvia Prewitt-Hayes, Witch Weekly, just a few. The bags went down onto the path. No. There's renewed interest in the Wizengamot Minutes affair, and given the release of the March correspondence. How did you find this address? Our readers have been asking for over a year where you... How did you find this address? The quill was writing. It was writing very fast, and Hermione could see, even upside down and in the dark, the shape of the sentence forming. Appeared agitated, dishevelled, living in reduced circumstances among Muggles. And then a shadow fell across the path, and Draco Malfoy came down his own drive with his coat unbuttoned and no wand in his hand, and stopped between Hermione and the woman with the notebook. "Prewitt-Hayes," he said, "you did my mother's trial." The quill faltered. "Mr. Malfoy, you wrote that she wept in the dock. She didn't. I was 4 feet away." His voice was perfectly level, and it was the most frightening thing Hermione had ever heard come out of him. "Now, you're going to go, and there won't be a piece, because if there is a piece, I shall give your editor 40 minutes of an interview about my family, on the record, with photographs, and I shall do it with somebody else. And after that, nobody in your profession will speak to you again, because you will have been the woman who had Draco Malfoy standing on a doorstep in Hampshire and came away with a paragraph about a cardigan." The silence went on for a long, long moment. "Charming," said Sylvia Prewitt-Hayes, and turned and walked to the corner of the lane, and was not there anymore. The street lamp buzzed. One of Hermione's bags had gone over, and an orange was rolling slowly down the path. "Well," said Malfoy. And Hermione Granger, to her own complete astonishment, said, "How dare you?" He turned. "I beg your pardon. How dare you stand in front of me?" She was going to... I know exactly what she was going to do. It came up out of her like something breaking loose from a riverbed. "I have had 11 years of it, Malfoy. I have had that quill pointed at me since I was 14 years old, and I know precisely what she was going to write and precisely how to stop her. And you stepped in front of me on my own path and handled it, and I stood there behind your shoulder like a parcel. You wanted her to write it? I wanted to deal with it myself." She was shouting in the street. Somewhere a curtain twitched at number 9, and she did not care at all. Do you know what everybody has always done? Everybody has always either needed me to save them or decided that I needed saving. And there has never once been a third option, not once in my entire life. And I came here, I gave up everything, so that there would be nobody standing between me and anything ever again. Her voice cracked on the last word and stopped. The fog had come back. It stood around the street lamp in a soft yellow globe, and the orange had come to rest against the base of the fence, and Draco Malfoy stood in the middle of the path and took it, every word, without moving. "Yes," he said at last. "All right. Don't just... You're right." Quietly. "I didn't ask you. I saw her and I put myself in the way of it without asking you, and that was..." He stopped, and she watched him refuse to reach for the easy, flattening phrase, watched him take the harder route through. That was for me, not for you. I have spent 3 years being able to protect precisely nobody, and I saw a chance, and I took it before you could tell me not to. Hermione stood with her hands open at her sides. She'll write it anyway, she said. You know she will. Not this week. In the spring, when the correspondence goes public. Probably. And then it starts again. Her breath went out. The letters. Miss Granger, will you comment? Miss Granger, some of us feel you have a responsibility, and I'll be back where I was, except that now they'll know the address. Yes. So, what do I do? He looked at her for a moment. Why are you asking me? Because you're the only person here. That isn't why. He shook his head slowly. Granger, you've known what to do since she opened her notebook. You've known for a year. You simply want somebody to be in the room when you decide, and that isn't the same as being saved. She stared at him. The fog moved. Down the lane, a door shut and a dog barked twice and stopped. Come inside, she said. Not yours. Mine. The box was at the back of the wardrobe under a spare duvet and a bag of curtain rings. She had not opened it since the September before last. She carried it downstairs and set it on the kitchen table, and Malfoy stood by the door with his coat still on and did not offer to help, which he understood afterwards to have been an act of extraordinary self-discipline. Inside, a bundle of letters, unread, 4 of them in Harry's handwriting. A ministry identification card with a photograph of a woman who looked exhausted. A dried sprig of something from a wedding. And, wrapped in a scarf, 10 3/4 inches of vinewood. Her hands stopped an inch above it. I don't know if it'll still... She stopped. It's been 14 months. It'll know you. You can't possibly... Granger, said Malfoy. It will know you. She picked it up. The warmth went through her palm and up her arm and into her chest all at once, unbearably familiar, like a voice from another room saying her name, and her eyes were streaming before she had understood that she was crying at all. She stood in her own kitchen holding her wand, with her shoulders going, making no noise whatsoever, and he crossed the room and did not touch her, and stood close enough that she could have leaned if she'd wanted to. She leaned. His arms came round her carefully, as though she were something that might be set off, and she pressed her face into the wool of his coat, which smelled of fog and coffee and wood smoke, and cried the way you cry when you have been holding a door shut for 14 months and have finally simply let go of the handle. It took a long time. When she surfaced, she did not move away, and neither did he, and his hand was moving very slowly along her spine, and her fingers had closed in the front of his coat and were not planning to open. I'm going to write to Harry, she said, into his collar. Good. And then I'm going to write to the Prophet and give them the whole thing, the minutes, the letters, my own account, all of it, before Prewitt Hayes can sell it in pieces. And then I'm going to go back to work. She lifted her head. Her eyes were swollen and her face was blotched, and she had never in her life looked less like a symbol. Not the ministry, not saving anybody. There's a legal aid office in Winchester that does Muggle-born inheritance cases, and they can't pay anything, and they've been advertising since June. You'd be extremely good at that. I'd be unbearable at that. Yes, he agreed. That's rather what I meant. And she laughed, wetly, disastrously, and looked up at him and found that his face was 6 inches away and that he had gone entirely still and that the whole kitchen had gone still with him. The clock on the wall, the fog at the black window, the cat asleep on the chair, the wand lying warm in her open hand on the table where she had set it down without noticing. "Malfoy," she said. "I know. You said you lied. About the house. About why you didn't sell it." "I did. Tell me the true thing." His hand came up and pushed the ruined hair back from her face and stayed there, cradling her jaw, his thumb resting just below her cheekbone, and she felt him take one breath and lose it. "I stayed," he said, "because it was the first place in 3 years where somebody shouted at me instead of going quiet when I walked in. And then the clock in the hall struck 8, and neither of them heard a single stroke of it. She kissed him. That was the order of it, and she was careful about the order afterwards, when she told it, much later in a kitchen, to a woman with red hair who put both hands over her mouth, because it mattered. He had been holding her face for 3 seconds and had not moved. He would have gone on not moving until the clock struck midnight. She understood that with absolute clarity in the instant before she did it, that he had decided, somewhere in 3 months of ironing newspapers and digging holes by hand, that whatever else happened, he would never be the one who reached. So she rose up on the balls of her feet and took hold of the front of his coat and kissed him. For a moment, he simply stopped existing. There was no other way to describe it. A total suspension, as though the man had been switched off. And then something came apart in him all at once, and his arms went round her properly, hard, one hand splayed across her back and the other in her hair. And he kissed her back with a kind of desperate care, as though he had been given something breakable and was not confident of his own hands. Her heel caught the leg of the chair. The chair went over. Crookshanks departed the room at speed and with feeling. Neither of them noticed. He tasted of coffee. He made a sound against her mouth, low, that she felt in her sternum rather than heard, and her fingers had got up into the short hair at the back of his neck, and the whole of her skin had come alive, and there was no thought in her head at all. None, for the first time in 11 months, not one single sentence, only the wool of his coat under her hands, and the heat of him and the fog pressing white against the black glass of the window. When they came apart, they did not go far. His forehead came down against hers. They stood in the middle of her kitchen, breathing like people who had run somewhere. "That took," said Malfoy unevenly, "an extraordinarily long time. 3 months. 19 years. Malfoy, don't," he said. "For the love of God, don't be reasonable at me now." So she wasn't. She kissed him again, and this time it was slower and much worse. And at some point his back met the edge of the table, and a jar of honey went over, and the honey ran quietly off the corner and onto the floor and stayed there until the following afternoon. The letter to Harry went on the 22nd of December. She wrote it 11 times. The version that went was 4 lines long and said, in essence, "I'm sorry. I'm alive. I live in Hampshire. Come at Christmas if you can bear it, and bring Ginny, and don't bring anybody else." She sent it with Perseus because she did not have an owl, and because the eagle owl now regarded her as a legitimate branch of his employment. He came back at 8 the next morning with a reply so short it made her sit down on the stairs. We were never going to stop looking, but we did stop asking, and I think that's what you needed. See you Thursday. H. P.S. Malfoy. Malfoy. P.P.S. Ginny wants to know everything. I want to know nothing. We have discussed this at length. Christmas was, by common agreement afterwards, a catastrophe of the highest quality. Harry Potter stood in the kitchen of number 12 Wisteria Lane, holding a glass of extremely good elf-made wine that Draco Malfoy had brought over the fence and handed to him without a word. And the two of them said almost nothing to each other for an hour and 40 minutes, and then discovered a shared and entirely genuine loathing for a particular ministry under-secretary, and did not stop talking until midnight. Ginny got the entire story out of Hermione in under 9 minutes flat, including the notebook, and then demanded to see the notebook, and read item 3, the tree. Deliberate note associations, churchyards, poison aloud in a carrying voice, while Malfoy stood at the window with his jaw set and the tips of his ears going a colour Hermione had never seen on him before. Fenwick, coaxed out with enormous patience, was given a hat by Ginny as a joke and burst into tears, and then would not be parted from it, and wore it for the next 11 years. The Prophet piece ran on the 4th of January, 7,000 words, all of it hers, unedited, with the March correspondence reproduced in full at the back. It did what she knew it would do. It detonated, and then it went quiet. And then a great many people who had stopped writing to her began writing to her again. She answered 4 of the letters. She burned the rest in the grate on a Sunday afternoon, with Malfoy sitting in the other chair pretending to read. And when the last one went up, she said, "There, that's it then." And he said, and turned a page he had not read, and reached across the space between the chairs without looking up, and she put her hand in his. She started at the Legal Aid Office in Winchester on the 29th of January. The pay was insulting. The filing system was an atrocity. Within 3 weeks, she had reorganized it entirely, made an enemy of a man called Barry, and won a case for a Muggle-born woman of 71, who had been quietly cheated out of her grandmother's cottage in 1974 by a solicitor who assumed no one would ever check. She came home that night and stood in the doorway of number 14 and said, "We won." And Malfoy looked up from the piano and said, "Obviously," and she crossed the room and kissed him in the middle of a bar of Chopin, and the piano made a noise like a sack of cutlery going downstairs. She used magic at work. She used it the way you use a spanner, because it was the right tool on a Tuesday for a specific problem, and then she put it back in the drawer. Some evenings she went a whole day without touching the wand. Some evenings she used it to get a jar down off a high shelf and thought nothing about it at all, which was, she reflected once, standing in her kitchen with a jar of mustard hovering at eye level, possibly the largest thing that had happened to her in 2 years. The mowing stayed at 6. He offered to change it formally in February in a manner that suggested he had rehearsed the sentence. She said no. She had come to like it, the drone starting up on the other side of the wall while she was still warm and half under. The way it meant the world was where she had left it, and that a specific person was in it, 20 feet away, doing something absurd for reasons he would never quite explain out loud. He got better at it. Not good. Better. The stripes stayed slightly drunk for the rest of his life. The yew came through the winter. It stood at the corner of his garden in front of her kitchen window, and it did not die, exactly as advertised, holding its dark green through the January frosts, while everything else on Wisteria Lane went brown and skeletal. And in April, it put out new growth at the tips, pale, almost yellow, soft as a fingertip. And Hermione stood at the sink one morning in her work coat with a cup of tea in her hand, and looked at it for so long that she missed the 8:14. She went out to it. She put her hand on the new growth. It was springy and slightly sticky and smelled green. 400 years, she thought. "You'll be late," said Malfoy from the fence. "I'm not going." "You're extremely going. You told me on Sunday that Barry has been misfiling the probate applications, and if you don't go in, he will misfile more of them, and then I shall have to hear about it for the entire weekend, which I will do, gladly, but I would rather hear about a triumph than an ongoing atrocity." She looked at him over the sagging panel. He was in shirt sleeves. It was 7 o'clock in the morning in April, and there was a fine mist coming off the grass, and he had a mug of coffee in one hand, and his hair was doing something it never did after 9, and she thought, with the calm of a fact arriving fully formed, "I would like to look at this every morning until I am very old." "Malfoy. Granger. Come here." He came. He put the coffee on the fence post and leaned on the top rail, and she took his face in both hands and kissed him over the boundary that they each owned half of at 7 o'clock in the morning, in full view of number 9, whose curtain twitched violently and was still. "Right," he said, when she let him go. He sounded slightly stunned, which he always did, which he suspected he always would. "Yes, good. I'm going to work. Yes, I'll be back at 6:30. 6:41, he said. The 6:12 doesn't run on Thursdays. He asked her in June. Not that. Not yet. That came the following spring, in a manner so badly handled and so completely successful that Ginny made him retell it 4 separate times at 4 separate dinners. This was smaller, and it took him, by Fenwick's later estimate, 3 weeks to work up to. She came home on a Thursday and found him standing at the fence with a tape measure and an expression of profound strategic concentration. "What are you doing?" "Measuring." "Yes, I can see that you're measuring. I'm asking what for." He straightened up. He wound the tape measure back in with unnecessary thoroughness and did not look at her, and she recognized the whole shape of it instantly. The cuff straightening, the delay, the man consulting a manual that did not exist for a situation it had never covered. "There's a section," he said, "in the book. The 1961 book. Chapter 9. On the subject of boundaries." He cleared his throat. "It says that where 2 households enjoy a particular cordiality, it is not uncommon, and is indeed considered a mark of some regard, for a gate to be set into the dividing fence, provided—" He stopped. "Provided?" "Provided," said Draco Malfoy, "that permission is properly sought." The evening light came down the lane, low and gold, catching the top of the yew and the whitewashed wall of the greenhouse, and the fine down on the back of his neck, where he had turned his head away from her. Hermione Granger set her bag down on the grass. She thought about a woman standing in this garden a year ago with a plastic watering can, letting a hydrangea die on purpose because she had wanted a life in which nothing needed her and nothing could reach her. She thought about how close she had come to getting it. "Malfoy," she said, "you have broken into my house, stolen my newspaper, terrorized my cat, planted a graveyard tree outside my kitchen window, and woken me at 6 in the morning approximately 140 times. That is a partial list. You may have a gate." He turned round then. Whatever was on his face, he didn't get it put away in time, and she saw all of it. The relief and the disbelief, and the thing underneath both. The thing he had been carrying up and down a lawn at dawn for the better part of a year. And she went to him over the wet grass and put her arms round his neck. "Ask me the other thing," she said against his mouth. "Not yet. Ask me eventually." "Granger," he said, "I have a book." The gate went in on the 2nd Saturday of July. It took him 9 hours, 3 trips to the ironmonger's, and 1 incident with a chisel that Hermione dealt with in 11 seconds and never mentioned again. It hung slightly crooked, and it caught on the flagstone in wet weather, and it made a small dry scrape when it opened, exactly like the broken hinge on the day she had first heard him in the garden. And for the next 40 years, whenever she heard that sound from inside the house, she would look up from whatever she was doing and put down her pen and go to the door.
Thank you for staying with me to the end. I want to tell you one small thing. There is a scene in the story I keep thinking about. Hermione is sick. She's alone. Nobody in the world knows. And then she finds soup on her table. Bad soup, burned at the bottom. There is a bone in it. And next to it, a note. No name. No, I was worried. Just few words about the weather. Sunday it rains after 2. That is the whole story for me. While I was writing, I keep thinking about the people who love us badly. Not people who love us less. People who simply do not know how. They say the wrong things. They mow the lawn at 6 in the morning. They never say, "I care about you." So they just say, "Don't hang the wishing out." We miss it. I have missed it. Someone loved me and I call this annoying because it did not look like love in a film. So here is what I believe. Kindness does not always arrive beautifully. Sometimes it arrives badly, sometimes it arrives with a bone in it. Look twice at the person next door. Look twice at your mother, your friend, the quiet one who is always fixing something. They may be saying it as the only language they have. Thank you for listening. I will see you in the next story.